Good morning, everyone. My name is Bert Samples, friend of Rick Lowe, part of the Project Rollins family, and I have to say that it's a truly great honor for this symposium to take place. Looking back and hearing some of the stories, the accolades that everyone has been presenting, it's making me realize, how things can come about. And I wanted to point out just a few things before I introduce the scholar today. I was reminded by researching Ms. Lipsitz's writings how, from the artist Paul Clay, artists make the invisible visible. And I also want you to pay attention as you leave this building, the art that's done on the facade of this building by Sam Durant. A lot can't be up forever. We have some here, a lot of serious critical thinkers, critical studies, and I'd like to acknowledge everyone here who will be here participating in the row house continuing. I just also want to say that being part of the genesis of this project and other visionary artists, that I've come to learn that when we started this, we had really no idea what the scope of what this may really evolve to and nurture to. I'm also reminded when I was reading this essay, there was a quote by Assata that when she came here, this place transformed me. And I can say that every time I come onto this campus, that it takes just the initiative just to move forward and give oneself, yourself to the others. And on that note, I'd like to introduce y'all and our speaker, Mr. George Jeffery.
Okay, what an honor it is to be introduced by Bert Samples, and what a pleasure it is to be back in the third ward, the third ward of Lightning Hopkins and Carl Hampton, Arnett Cobb and Albert Collins, the place that nurtured the artistry of John Biggers and Carol Blue and beyond, where these days perhaps I should say John Biggers, Carol Blue and Beyonce. But this is the place where John Biggers talked about painting third ward women, organized women, women who when they go to vote take the whole block with them. And there's a sense of connection, community here, that all of the vicious and pathologies of white supremacy have not been able to drown out, because there's a fire here that no water can put out. There's a human desire, a human imagination that is of tremendous importance. Musician Horace Tapscott grew up just a few blocks from here, and he said it was a village and a school. And he didn't mean the school was a school, he meant the neighborhood was a village and a school. His mother put a piano by the front door of their house. You couldn't come into the house unless you sat down and played something on the piano. That's an interesting view of decor. That's an interesting view of space. And of course, it's part of why we're here today. That Project Row House is a being, an entity that is of tremendous importance, not only in Houston, but to people around the world. And I'm hoping today that we can think about where we've been, where we are, where we're going, and think about the importance of this small space. I can't describe Project Row Houses from close up. You could do that. You know what it looks like from this vantage point. I know what it looks like from far away. Not only from my optic on it, but from the things that people have shared with me when I've gone around the nation and the world talking about Project Row Houses. I talk about Project Row Houses everywhere I go. Like B.B. King, I'm no refrigerator, I can't keep nothing. You know, I'm talking about what's here, because what I see and what people speak back to me say they see here is the enduring embodiment of Afro-diasporic ways of being and becoming, of building and belonging. These are ways that enable the survival of Africans in America, which itself is a miracle. And their humanity is a miracle, and their commitment to democracy is a miracle. The people farthest from the fruits and benefits of democracy turned out to value it the most and contribute the most to it. But these ideas are important not only because they have a history, they are needed more now than ever. And not just by black people, but by people all around the world. We live in an age that we sometimes don't even want to look at. And we've been trained to look at visual artifacts, but we don't always look at the fact that we live in a time of calculated cruelty, of mass incarceration, of enforced austerity, of organized abandonment of entire populations. And that means we have serious work to do. It means we have to challenge ourselves for the difficult tasks that lie ahead. And the people on the panel before this were talking about some of the difficulties. You know, sometimes there's no perfect way. There's no one path that works. When you learn to play a musical instrument, they tell you practice makes perfect. But social practice doesn't make perfect. Social practice makes the world a little less imperfect. And then you have to respond to that and improvise around it. Making art, being for social justice are hard things to do. Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, the great activist from Ruralville, Mississippi, used to say that fighting for social justice was a lot like sharecropping. There are only 3 weeks of the year when it's hard. But those weeks are last week, this week, and next week. And so, if we look at the task that's ahead of us, we need to focus not only on the surface appearances of what's going on here, but what's at the heart, but what's at the root. What kind of space is this? And I want to submit to you that one of the most important things generated at Project Row Houses is that much talked about but little understood entity called love. We live in a society that throws that word around a lot, that uses it as a marketing term, that deals with it carelessly in romance novels and films. But love is serious business. If the Africans brought to America, not even owning the skin on their backs, being pitted against each other, being told that they were property, being made often by the conditions of their lives into things and beings that were unlovable, seeing in each other's eyes a measure of their own subordination and humiliation. If they had not loved each other, they would not have survived, and we would not be here today. And that love is what I see being held in stewardship here in Project Row Houses. The great James Baldwin used to say, the world is held together, really it is, by the love and the passion of a very few people. But those people have networks of instruction and apprenticeship. Those people are able to love because they've been loved. And so that means when we come here, we have both a debt and an obligation. We're here because somebody loves somebody else, because somebody who had every reason to give in to existential despair, somebody who had every reason to think that there was not going to be a future, refused that, loved each other and loved us and tried to create something. And it's our obligation to pass that love on to future generations. In his letter to his nephew that James Baldwin wrote in 1962 when his nephew was 14 years old, he says, I remember that day when you were born. He says, we were trembling then. We didn't know how we'd feed you. We didn't know if it was right to bring you into this world. He said, we were trembling then, and we have not stopped trembling yet, but if we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. And so part of what I think is being created at Project Row Houses is a continuation of that love, and I think we have much to learn from it, but we also have to interrogate it. We have to criticize it. We have to ask, are we doing the right things with it? That means we might need to change our approach. It might mean at this moment in time, we might need to do things differently. The Swedish anthropologist Otebenga says that you can sometimes wind up doing your art and your work in the world simply by habit. You do today what you did yesterday. It worked for you in the past, so you continue to do it. And Henner says if we don't stop and change what we do from time to time, our work will become what he described as Scandinavian cooking, which he says is a practice passed down from generation to generation for no apparent reason. But we have a reason. And the reason has to do with the art as what I want to call a way to other worlds. This is a concept that I take from the great Robert Farris Thompson's essay about a community artist named Henry Dorsey. And what Thompson says is Henry Dorsey, living in Kentucky in the mid-20th century, didn't know it, but he was carrying on a distinctly African tradition. The Yoruba of West Africa say that everybody should make art. Not because they thought everybody would be equally skilled, not because they thought everybody could produce the same kinds of products, not because they didn't believe that there was a discipline and artistry required. But they said if everybody makes art, you can learn how to recognize significant communications. You have to be an art maker to recognize what is significant and what is insignificant. Many things come to us, especially in a society saturated with products and images and power announcing themselves as significant. They may not be significant at all. Other things don't make that announcement. They might be small houses doing big work in a neighborhood that might not otherwise be seen. But they can be tremendously significant if you know how to read them right. And of course, we need to cultivate the capacity to recognize significance among as many people as we can. Because the type of change that we need to see in this world, in an age when the populations that many of us care about most are increasingly displaced, dispossessed, disinherited, and just plain dis. Under these conditions, it's important for us to involve a whole people in their own survival. In their own creation of another world. No one will do for us what we fail to do for ourselves. And so we need to figure out what is it that we need to do now. And when Thompson talked about Henry Dorsey, he said that Dorsey drew on the African concept of ashe, which is a work you do in the world that makes a difference, work filled with spirit, work that is a privilege of righteous living. It's not a right, it can be easily lost, but the work of ashe means that when doors open or close, where we have to make decisions that forever affect us, we have the capacity to choose, to make a moral judgment, to make a political judgment. Now, Henry Dorsey is a strange artist for Thompson to write about. And he wasn't writing about him because he was a unique innovator. He wasn't writing about him because other people recognized him as great and changed their art as a result. Henry Dorsey is important to Thompson because he so seamlessly enters into that long river of resistance that is in the Afro-diasporic imagination in the Americas and around the world. Dorsey suffered an industrial accident at the age of 25, and it diminished his ability to hear. And he had a lack then that he had to figure out to turn into a surplus. He had a disadvantage that he had to make into an advantage. He suffered a humiliation that he needed to transform into honor. He had to take the poison of his disability and turn it into a kind of medicine. And this is the history of black people in America because of what they brought with them in their heads. Kidnapped in Africa, brought to America in chains, not even owning the skin on their backs. They had one thing that was very, very valuable. And that is a way of knowing, a way of solving problems that said every problem has a solution, that things need to be inverted. The sense of parallel construction, where they could see what some people thought had no value and turn it into an object of value. And if you can see a thing like a rag and turn it into a thing of value like a quilt, if you can see a discarded object from the beauty industry and the way that Flower Man Turner did for many years in the Third Ward and turn it into something that gives beauty a new meaning, then you can see possibility where other people only see one option, that you can see value where other people see no value. You can see potential where other people see only failure. And so this lack of hearing meant that Henry Dorsey had to develop his desire to see. And he felt, since he couldn't hear, he decided to go around the country seeing things. He became a hobo, traveled across the nation. He worked as a roustabout on the river fronts. He worked as a railroad worker. And being a black man in America, much of what he saw appalled him. His travels exposed him to scenes of racial cruelty, of exploitation, of opportunity hoarding. But he also saw in his travels the indefatigable spirit of resistance, the willingness, work, and wit of black people. He saw trees adorned with bottles. He saw sculptures made of automobile tires and hubcaps, installations composed of scrap iron and discarded pieces of black plastic. He saw people who put pinwheels and hubcaps in the front of their house to capture the motion of travel or going somewhere. He saw people who would nail a mirror to the front of their house, their door, in order to capture the flash of the spirit of the ancestors. Everywhere he went, he saw people with little containers of water medicating their houses, containers that contained water, which symbolized rivers, which symbolized the connection between generations, between the living and the dead, made you feel that something contained in a small space held the way, opened the door to a wider world. And so this insistence on trying to find life where life was in peril, to use clay and plants to capture the natural powers of the biological world, to use levers and pulleys to capture the power of the mechanical world. All of these were ways not to give in to existential despair. After 10 years on the road, Dorsey returned home to Kentucky and decided to decorate the house he inherited from his father. He carved the names and birth dates of his children on a concrete tablet recessed in the wall on the chimney. He put commemorative shells, an old West African tradition. He put commemorative seashells with the initials of his children's first names. He created motion sculptures out of metal pipes, pulleys, and tractor tires. He adorned them with plastic dolls, ice cube trays, and assorted parts from a washing machine. He marked the death of his sister with a headstone in his yard placed on a coffer of iron flanked by a one-wheeled locomotive rooted in the ground. And Thompson tells us these are all sites of moral instruction. They're attempts to do work in the world, to use the properties of material things to bring about spiritual ends. They send a message about the importance of mastering and using things rather than complaining about them, about responding to injury and provocation with laughter and generosity, using discarded objects as a provocation for seeing the potential in things that are undervalued. And of course, these are the practices that don't start with Henry Dorsey. His slave ancestors did this from the moment the first African was put on a ship and made to cross the Atlantic. Quilt makers took patches of worn-out garments and containers and stitched them into patterned bed covers. They created fashions that used syncopation, just as black musicians use syncopation in time. They use staggered patterns in cloth, because in Senegambia they say the direct way is never the right way. Evil travels in a straight line. So you learn indirection, you learn disguise and surprise, you learn to do things in more than one way, to not accept the surface appearances of the world as the way things are or the way things have to be. Slaves who were forced to cut cane in the sugar fields of Louisiana looked at the stems
of those sugarcane plants, and they drilled holes in them, and they assorted them in a pattern and turned them into mouth harps, music to accompany dancing late at night. And dancing itself constituted an act of inversion because it turned the exploited work body into a play body. It turned the actions used for labor on the job for communication, coordination, self-expression. And so, in expressive culture, in medicine, in politics, all of this revolves around African practices that become something new in America. They become a school of thought created by what they call the conjure doctor. The conjure doctor is the person who turns hegemony on its head, transforms reality by taking efficacious materials and figuring out what to do with them. And here's what Thompson says about it, and I think it's crucial to what's gone on here at Project Row Houses. He says, the thing you can learn from Henry Dorsey is that if you know where you're going and where you're coming from, you can decorate the way to other worlds, the road to the ancestors and to God, and your name will merge forever with His glory. The way to other worlds, the way to work in a small space and move to a larger space. This was no abstract, existential, psychological question for people contained on plantations where they were not allowed to move and travel. Even free blacks were not allowed to move without passes, without permission. After slavery ended, the slave system didn't disappear. Malcolm used to say, the names change, but the game's the same. And so there was a form of formal freedoms which slavery didn't exist. But the black codes replaced slavery, and Jim Crow segregation replaced the black codes, and restrictive covenants replaced Jim Crow segregation, and redlining replaced the racial the restrictive covenants, and urban renewal that destroyed 1,600 black communities, including the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Ward in Houston by building highways through them. It didn't destroy them, but disrupted them. All of these were things that emanated from those original conditions. In the 1968 fair housing case of Jones v. Meyer, the Supreme Court made an amazing admission. An interracial couple named Jones wanted to move into the Paddock Hills subdivision, the all-white Paddock Hills subdivision in the suburbs of St. Louis. And the court had to decide whether the 14th Amendment and the 13th Amendment enabled Congress to pass a law saying that you couldn't have housing discrimination. People had the right to purchase a house if they could afford it. This was a legal question, up to 1968. And the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment ends slavery. The 14th Amendment gives equal protection of the law. It says Congress can pass laws that get rid of the emblems and badges of slavery. And so in 1968, 100 years after the adoption of those amendments, the Supreme Court said, when ghettos exist, when people don't have a free choice in where they want to live, this is an emblem and badge of slavery unwilling to die. That it's slavery even though it's 100 years after slavery. And those badges and emblems are part of our everyday life. They didn't die in 1865 or 1930 or 1968. And Justice Douglas's concurring opinion with that case, he says, you want to know where slavery is in America? It's in the minds and hearts of too many white people. And so if that slavery is still there, the techniques of slave resistance are still valuable. The freedom dreams of black people, which did so much, not only for black people, but for all people. There would be no equal protection of the law for sexual minorities, for people with disabilities, no equal funding for women's activities for men, had it not been for what black people newly freed from slavery created on their own in what Dr. Du Bois called abolition of democracy. And so we inherit that tradition when we look around our neighborhood, but we also have to deal with this issue of slavery and willing to die. And under that regime, everything you do is going to be wrong, according to the people in power. After the Civil War, they wanted to recreate the conditions of servitude. They wanted black people to work for whites. They didn't want them to be able to bargain freely over wages and working conditions. So even though slavery was outlawed, they could arrest black people for two things. If you stayed where you were and weren't hired by a white person, they arrested you for loitering and no visible means of support. If you went looking for a job, they arrested you for vagrancy. So if you stayed where you were guilty of loitering. If you went somewhere else, you were guilty of vagrancy. What Ruthie Gilmore says is that the only things that could get black people arrested after the Civil War were either moving or standing still. Everything else is okay. And many legal scholars say that the drug laws today, the differential enforcement of them, differential penalties, are a modern-day form of those vagrancy and loitering laws. That everything you do is going to be wrong. And so you have to make your own rightness. And you have to find other people around the world who will work with you, who share some similar things and can learn from and with you. And of course, you have to find something left to love in yourselves and in each other. You need an art that imbues the world with the potential to make right things come to pass. Now this use of art as social practice is always black, it's never only black. All peoples around the world, all religions and races have traditions of social justice. And today, the people of the world need to delve deeply into those traditions to find ways to control or at least use spaces they inhabit but they don't control. Now I want to show you a couple of videos of artists who are not black, and then I want to finish up with one who is black, who are doing things that I think resonate with what's going on here at Project Row Houses. So I want to start with a video of Ramiro Gomez, who's a 27-year-old young man in Los Angeles. He's from San Bernardino. He found himself, he dropped out of college. He's an artist. He couldn't find steady work except as a nanny in the Hollywood Hills, Bel Air, and Beverly Hills. And so his working class parents are out there laboring, and he's going to take care of the children of extremely wealthy people. And when he goes to his job, he sees that the richest neighborhoods in Los Angeles during the day are Latino neighborhoods. Because the white people are gone. But the nannies, the gardeners, the landscapers, the cleaners are all Latinos. And he thinks they do valuable work, they make the neighborhood look beautiful, but they're despised. Their language and culture are criminalized, they're talked about as if they were parasites. And at nighttime, when they go back to the east side, and the white people come back in, the neighborhood looks beautiful, and the Latino workers aren't there. So Ramiro decided that he would use acrylic spray paint and discarded cardboard boxes from Best Buy, and he would make paintings of those workers to watch over the neighborhood when the real workers were no longer there. He wanted them to be witnesses of their own labor. He wanted there to be a visible image of the work that they had done. He wanted to find value and show the value in things that other people saw as valueless. So if we could show that first video, Latino Street Artist, let's take a look.